In December 1941, the Philippine Commonwealth ceased to function as a territorial government. Japanese forces landed across Luzon within hours of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Manila was declared an open city. Within weeks, organized resistance collapsed into retreat, and by May 1942, the surrender of Corregidor formally ended conventional defense of the archipelago. From a military perspective, the Philippines were lost. From a governmental perspective, however, the situation was less settled than it appeared. The assumption that followed Japan's occupation was widely shared and rarely examined, that once a territory fell, its political relevance diminished in direct proportion to its military defeat. Under this logic, governments in exile existed primarily as symbolic remnants, useful for morale but operationally marginal. Real decisions, real leverage, and real influence were assumed to belong to those still holding ground. This assumption shaped early American and Allied thinking about the Philippines. The islands were reclassified as a future objective rather than an active front. Planning attention shifted to Australia, the Central Pacific, and the industrial mobilization required for a long war. In Washington, Philippine affairs were expected to recede into diplomatic maintenance mode, handled by formal channels, managed by the State Department, and subordinated to broader Allied priorities. That expectation would prove incorrect. What policymakers did not anticipate was that the Philippine government, though dispossessed of territory, would reorganize itself into a functional political and strategic instrument operating from within the American capital itself. Not as a refugee delegation, not as a ceremonial exile corps, but as a working headquarters embedded inside the U.S. wartime bureaucracy. This arrangement did not arise from improvisation alone. It was the product of a pre-war assumption that had shaped Philippine-American relations for decades, that the Commonwealth was not merely a colonial possession, but a political entity in transition towards sovereignty, with institutional legitimacy recognized by U.S. law. The Philippine Independence Act of 1934 had established a 10-year timetable toward full independence. By 1941, the Commonwealth possessed its own president, legislature, and diplomatic representatives. Its armed forces were integrated with U.S. command structures, but its political leadership operated under constitutional authority. When Japanese occupation severed territorial control, that authority did not dissolve, it displaced. President Manuel L. Quezon's evacuation to the United States in late 1940 preserved the continuity of the Commonwealth government. Crucially, it preserved its legal recognition. The Philippine government in exile was not treated as an informal advocacy group. It retained official status, access, and standing within the American system. This distinction mattered because it shaped what the government could do and what it assumed it should do. The foundational belief guiding Philippine leaders in Washington was that occupation did not negate political agency. On the contrary, they believed that sustained pressure, constant visibility, and bureaucratic integration could influence American war planning in ways battlefield resistance alone could not. Their objective was not to command troops or direct campaigns. It was to ensure that the Philippines remained a central strategic commitment rather than a deferred promise. This belief was grounded in practical realities. The Philippine government lacked an army, a navy, or territory. What it possessed instead was proximity. Proximity to Congress, proximity to the War Department, proximity to the White House. Operating from Washington allowed Philippine officials to engage the American system at its point of decision rather than at its periphery. The assumption underlying this approach was simple but risky. That influence could be generated through sustained institutional engagement rather than through military leverage. That access, if used relentlessly, could shape outcomes even when the balance of power appeared overwhelmingly unfavorable. For American officials, this arrangement initially seemed benign. Hosting the Commonwealth government required minimal resources. It reinforced public narratives of liberation and justice. It carried no immediate operational cost, yet beneath the surface, it introduced a persistent variable into U.S. wartime planning, one that resisted marginalization. The Philippine headquarters in Washington did not function as a single office or building. It operated as a distributed presence across multiple agencies. Legal advisors tracked legislation affecting post-war governance. Military liaisons monitored planning assumptions regarding liberation timelines. Diplomatic staff coordinated with allied governments to maintain recognition of Philippine sovereignty. Intelligence channels quietly aggregated reports from guerrilla networks still operating inside the islands. None of these activities were decisive in isolation. Their power lay in accumulation. The Philippine leadership understood that American war planning was not static. It evolved through committees, memoranda, budget allocations, and inter-service debates. Decisions were rarely final. They were revisited, revised, and reframed as conditions changed. By embedding themselves into this process, Philippine officials aimed to shape the premises upon which those decisions rested. The core assumption, shared by Quezon and his advisors, was that silence equaled irrelevance. If the Philippines faded from daily administrative consideration, they risked becoming a secondary theater indefinitely. If, however, Philippine concerns were continuously present, raised in briefings, cited in reports, embedded in legal frameworks, then their liberation would remain not just a moral objective, but an operational expectation. This approach also rested on a second assumption, that American institutions could be influenced from within by actors who understood their logic. Philippine officials did not appeal primarily to sentiment. They spoke the language of policy, law, and logistics. They framed arguments in terms of alliance credibility, regional stability, and post-war order. They aligned Philippine objectives with American strategic self-interest. This was not accidental. Many Philippine leaders had been educated in American institutions. They understood congressional procedure, executive authority, and military bureaucracy. They recognized that wartime Washington was not a monolith, but a contested environment in which priorities competed for attention and resources. The risk, however, was structural. The Philippine government in exile depended entirely on American goodwill. It possessed no independent enforcement mechanism. Its influence existed only so long as U.S. officials found it useful, tolerable, or politically expedient. A single shift in strategic emphasis, a decision to prioritize Europe more completely, or to bypass the Philippines in favor of alternate Pacific routes, could render years of advocacy moot. By early 1942, this risk became visible. As Allied losses mounted across the Pacific, American planners began considering strategies that de-emphasized immediate Philippine liberation. Proposals emerged that envisioned isolating Japanese forces rather than confronting them directly. The Philippines, under this logic, could be contained until later phases of the war. This moment represented the first serious challenge to the assumption sustaining the Philippine headquarters in Washington. The belief that access equaled influence encountered the reality of global war priorities. The question was no longer whether Philippine officials could be heard, but whether hearing them would matter. By mid-1942, the assumption that the Philippines' political future could be secured through institutional presence alone began to erode. The system the Philippine government relied upon was about to be tested under conditions of scarcity, competing theaters, and hard strategic trade-offs. By 1942, this assumption stopped being true. The failure of the Philippine government and exile system did not occur at a single meeting or through a single decision. It unfolded incrementally between late 1942 and mid-1944, as American war planning evolved faster than political advocacy could adapt. The breakdown was not procedural, it was structural. At the center of the failure was a widening gap between strategic abstraction and operational necessity. By November 1942, the United States had committed itself to a dual theater war with finite resources. Europe retained formal priority, while the Pacific demanded increasing force commitments following Guadalcanal. Within the Pacific, the Joint Chiefs of Staff began refining a sequencing problem, which objectives were essential for advancing toward Japan, and which could be deferred or neutralized. In this context, the Philippines became a variable rather than a constant. American planners evaluated the archipelago through metrics increasingly divorced from political symbolism. Distance to Japan, airfield utility, naval basing potential, and enemy force density became the dominant criteria. When analyzed under these terms, the Philippines presented challenges. Japanese garrisons were large, terrain favored defense, casualty projections were high. Alternative routes through the Central Pacific appeared to offer more direct pressure on Japan with fewer immediate costs. The Philippine headquarters in Washington continued to argue relevance, but the terms of debate had shifted. Advocacy framed around sovereignty and obligation now competed with staff studies emphasizing efficiency and attrition minimization. The system designed to influence assumptions was now confronting assumptions hardened by operational modeling. Chronologically, the inflection point emerged in early 1943. In January, Allied leaders met at Casablanca, reaffirming unconditional surrender as the war aim. While Pacific specifics remained fluid, the emphasis on decisive force application intensified. In Washington, planning staffs accelerated comparative analyses of Pacific pathways. The Philippines were no longer presumed to be a mandatory objective. They were one option among several. Throughout 1943, this recalibration continued. The Gilbert and Marshall Islands campaigns demonstrated the viability of selective advances supported by overwhelming naval and air power. Each success reinforced the logic that bypassing strongholds could yield strategic momentum without immediate liberation of occupied territories. Philippine officials responded by escalating informational input. Guerrilla reports emphasized Japanese logistical strain. Intelligence summaries highlighted the cost of occupation. Political memoranda warned of post-war instability if liberation were delayed too long. These efforts were not ignored, but they were increasingly contextualized as secondary considerations. The failure here was not one of access. Philippine representatives still attended meetings. They still submitted papers. They still met senior officials. The failure lay in the declining weight assigned to their inputs relative to operational imperatives. This imbalance became visible in internal American correspondence. Planning documents referenced the Philippines less frequently as a strategic objective and more often as a contingency. Liberation dates became provisional. Force allocations were hedged. Language shifted from commitments to possibilities. By mid-1943, the Philippine system had lost its ability to anchor planning assumptions. It could react, but it could no longer define premises. A critical moment occurred with the development of competing Pacific strategies. General Douglas MacArthur advocated a return to the Philippines via New Guinea, arguing that bypassing the islands would leave a major enemy force intact and undermine American credibility. The Navy, supported by portions of the Joint Chiefs, favored a Central Pacific thrust toward the Marianas. The Philippine government in exile aligned naturally with MacArthur's position, yet this alignment exposed a vulnerability. By tethering its influence to a specific operational advocate, the Commonwealth risked being sidelined if that advocate lost institutional standing. For much of 1943, this appeared likely. Naval successes strengthened the Central Pacific argument. Resource constraints sharpened inter-service rivalry. In this environment, Philippine advocacy was increasingly filtered through the lens of service politics rather than strategic necessity. The system's failure became irreversible not because Philippine officials stopped arguing, but because the framework within which arguments mattered narrowed. By early 1944, American industrial output had expanded sufficiently to alter calculations. The question was no longer whether resources existed, but where to apply them. At this stage, Philippine advocacy regained partial traction, but too late to claim causality. The decision to return to the Philippines, formalized in mid-1944, was driven primarily by operational logic, control of sea lanes, isolation of Japanese forces in Southeast Asia, and establishment of forward bases. Political considerations aligned with this outcome, but they did not determine it. The Philippine headquarters in Washington had succeeded in maintaining relevance. It had failed in controlling outcomes. This distinction matters because it reveals the limits of institutional influence without enforcement power. The Commonwealth government preserved its voice, but it could not compel prioritization. When strategic consensus hardened around alternative routes, Philippine inputs were absorbed, acknowledged, and ultimately subordinated. The irreversible point occurred when American planners finalized force allocations for 1944 operations. Once shipping, air assets, and divisions were scheduled, political advocacy could not alter sequencing. At that moment, the Philippine system's influence shifted from shaping decisions to interpreting them. The failure was therefore not total. The system did not collapse. It endured, but it failed to achieve its central objective, ensuring that Philippine liberation remained a non-negotiable strategic assumption throughout the war. Instead, liberation occurred when it aligned with American operational advantage, not when political continuity demanded it. This outcome exposes the core weakness of the system. Proximity without leverage can sustain attention, but it cannot override strategic optimization under wartime conditions. The consequences of the Philippine government in exile's limited influence were not immediately visible. In the short term, the system appeared to have worked. The Commonwealth remained intact. Its leadership retained recognition. Its return to the archipelago in 1944 occurred under American auspices and with formal restoration of authority. On the surface, continuity had been preserved. The deeper consequences, however, unfolded across strategic, institutional, and post-war dimensions, and only became clear once the war's momentum rendered earlier debates irrelevant. From the American perspective, the delay in committing decisively to Philippine liberation reshaped the conduct of the Pacific War. Japanese forces in the Philippines were not neutralized until late 1944, allowing Tokyo to retain control over critical sea lanes for far longer than Philippine officials had warned. This prolonged Japan's access to resources in Southeast Asia and complicated Allied logistics during intermediate campaigns. What commanders did not yet fully understand was that occupation itself had strategic costs beyond troop numbers. The longer Japan held the Philippines, the more deeply it entrenched defensive networks, exploited local infrastructure, and inflicted damage that would complicate post-war recovery. By the time American forces returned, the islands had been subjected to sustained economic disruption, civilian hardship, and guerrilla warfare that eroded institutional capacity. For the Philippine leadership, the consequences were more structural. Operating from Washington preserved legitimacy, but it also constrained agency. The Commonwealth government had become dependent on alignment with American operational priorities. Its survival as a political entity was secured, but at the price of strategic autonomy. This dependency shaped post-war dynamics. Liberation occurred on American terms, through American command structures, and according to American sequencing. Philippine civil authority was restored quickly, but within a framework defined by U.S. military necessity. Reconstruction priorities, security arrangements, and economic recovery were all conditioned by wartime decisions made without Philippine enforcement power. The system that had sustained the government in exile could not be rapidly dismantled. Its methods, bureaucratic advocacy, reliance on access, alignment with external priorities, continued into the post-war period. Independence arrived in 1946, but institutional habits formed during exile persisted, influencing defense policy, foreign relations, and economic planning. Enemy adaptation further underscores the consequences. Japanese planners had initially underestimated the political dimension of occupation. They focused on military control, assuming that exile governments posed minimal threat. This assumption held tactically but failed strategically. The existence of a functioning Philippine government in exile preserved Allied legitimacy in the region and complicated Japanese efforts to consolidate authority. Yet this did not translate into decisive wartime leverage. Japan adapted by fortifying the archipelago and exploiting the delay in Allied return. Occupation became a holding action, not a liability severe enough to force early abandonment. At this point, a major analytical revelation becomes unavoidable. Political continuity without coercive capacity can preserve identity, but it cannot dictate tempo. If you find this kind of forgotten military history as compelling as we do, we'd be honored if you'd consider subscribing. These stories matter because they explain not just what happened, but why. The full impact of the Philippine government in exile's experience would only become clear later, as policymakers assessed why sustained access had failed to translate into sustained prioritization. The answer lay not in personalities or intent, but in system design. The system failed because it operated in a domain dominated by optimization logic. Wartime American planning increasingly favored routes that minimized risk and maximized pressure on Japan's core. Political obligations were acknowledged, but they remained subordinate to force employment calculus. No amount of advocacy could override this hierarchy once it solidified. The lesson of the secret Philippine headquarters in Washington is not one of neglect or betrayal. It is a lesson about structural power. What failed was not diplomacy, intelligence coordination, or political persistence. What failed was the assumption that influence within another state's decision system could substitute for independent leverage. The Philippine government in exile mastered access but lacked veto power. It could inform, persuade, and remind, but it could not compel. Correction was impossible because the system functioned as designed. American institutions responded rationally to incentives shaped by global war. Once alternative strategies promised faster progress at lower cost, political continuity arguments could not reassert primacy. By the time industrial capacity expanded enough to accommodate multiple routes, sequencing decisions were already locked. This case remains relevant to modern institutions operating under dependency. Governments, organizations, and movements that rely on proximity to power rather than control of resources face similar limits. Access sustains relevance. It does not guarantee priority. The Philippine headquarters in Washington was not a failure in absolute terms. It preserved legitimacy, ensured restoration, and prevented political erasure. But it demonstrates a critical boundary. Systems designed to influence must also account for the incentives governing those they seek to influence. In war, as in institutions, Outcomes are determined not by presence alone, but by who controls the assumptions that shape decisions.